So Benjamin Goossen is a historian at the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago, with a focus on European and international history, science and technology studies, and the history of the environment. Chosen Nation was published by the Princeton University Press in 2017. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Sam. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I do a couple set of questions I ask everyone, and it's just more in terms of the history profession and writing and doing research in general. So how did you first get into the field of history?
So I think that there's at least two major aspects of what historians do, as I understand it. One is to understand the past on its own terms, and the second is to think about the ways that the past informs the present. And one of the things that the historian can do is try to reconcile those around a particular topic. And so I came into the historical profession with a set of questions around what it meant to be Mennonite in the present day, and to think about the way that Mennonites imagine themselves as a community and as part of the societies that they lived in and moved through during various historical epochs across the world. And history seems to me to be a useful discipline with useful tools to be able to ask questions that had emerged for me in the context of my own life as someone who comes from originally a Mennonite community in Kansas.
So you like, even in high school, was it your favorite subject, or was it just purely when you got to college, you had these questions and you looked at the fields and it's like maybe political science, maybe economics, but like history was the one that fit the best?
I always had a strong interest in history. There was sorry, my doorbell's going off, but I don't think it's for me. Yes, I always had a strong interest in history as a discipline. Including in middle school and high school. There's a fabulous nationwide program here in the United States called History Day, National History Day. And I was an avid participant in that in a variety of different categories. I would highly recommend it to anyone in middle school or high school who has interest in history. But I would say that I was really taken with a number of classes that I took very early as an undergraduate at Swarthmore College, including a class on the American West with a terrific historian, Allison Dorsey, as well as a class on nations and nationalism in Eastern Europe with Peter Judson. I took both of those my first year in college, and I thought, wow, here are some tools that can really explain really tough questions that I wanted to develop answers to.
I talked with Judson yesterday, and he said he was very impressed by both this book, but also that it developed from was it your senior thesis from your BA, or?
Yeah, I originally wrote a rather long undergraduate thesis on Mennonites and nationalism that covers essentially the first half of the material that's in the published version of Chosen Nation. And that developed out of a conversation with Peter Judson in I think 2009 or 2010. And he had really a wonderful vision for how I might go about researching the relationship between Mennonites, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, and the phenomenon of modern nationalism in terms of doing research in Europe, and also integrating that history with some of the most exciting work that has been done by historians of nations and nationalism in recent years.
So I have a question on actually Judson and kind of you, but before I get into that, like you note in either the introduction or the couple pages preceding the introduction that it was really your grandfather, and him being both a proud Prussian but also a pacifist Mennonite. That's kind of what the starting point with you kind of questioning it. Was there a moment in history in your life when you were talking with your grandpa or you read something and it reminded you of your grandpa, and you really, that's when you began to question the duality of this, what does it mean to be Mennonite Germanness versus religious nature?
Yeah, I think a lot of historians of Mennonites have noted the incongruence between um, the self-narratives that certain Mennonite groups developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, including in the United States, about their so-called separateness from the world and separateness from the societies that they lived in. Um, Very few historians have taken that self-narrative at face value, but in my particular case, what was interesting to me was the connection between this claim uh, to exist sort of outside the world that was a popular narrative among the Mennonites that I grew up with, combined with the specific affinity that my grandfather had for Germany, for the German language, and for German history. He was someone who grew up speaking German in Nebraska and was a lifelong Mennonite minister, someone who taught peace and pacifism from the pulpit, and himself would have very happily ascribed to the idea that Mennonites exist outside of, or ought to exist outside of, the kind of earthly nations that are today the main organizing society, politically speaking, the main organizing principle of societies, politically speaking. And yet there was this way in which he very playfully would identify himself as a proud Prussian. That was a term that he used to talk about himself. He certainly wasn't someone who could be described in any meaningful sense as a German nationalist. But even that kind of playful self-ascription as a proud Prussian raised for me as a young person the question, what is this sort of partial or playful or latent identification with Germany and German culture doing in this particular Mennonite community? And is there a bigger story here about the relationship between Mennonites and German nationalism that I can dig into? And when I was at Swarthmore and taking courses on the history of nations and nationalism in Eastern Europe, I began to learn about the emergence of nationalism and the process of nation building, and the way to think about that as fundamentally historical. And I then, in conversation with Peter Judson, developed the project that became Chosen Nation, which was an effort to look into the relationship between Mennonites and German nationalism from a historical perspective.
Yeah, so one of Judson and Dr. Tara Zara's big concepts they like to talk about is political indifference or national indifference. This idea of a lot of groups within the Habsburg Empire and other national groups, although there's this idea that, well, they must have been very proud of being a nation. Most of the time, they were just kind of, okay, maybe sign their name to it, but they're just kind of living their lives. There's a lot of national indifference to them. And it's really just these nationalists who are kind of the core of pushing a nationalist agenda. I thought it was so interesting because you would think national indifference, that would kind of go hand in hand with like just the typical story of Mennonites, or the story that Mennonites tell themselves, that they are not typically tied into nationalism or governments or politics, that they're much more not of this world, the quiet in the land, etc. But your book kind of goes against that. I thought it was interesting that you're coming from this genealogy of Peter Judson as your advisor, but you're kind of talking about the actual fact that there's a lot of nationalism, or that there's a lot of Mennonite nationalists. So how did you get to that, and how did you deal with that kind of tension between this idea of Judson's idea of national indifference and Mennonite ideal of political apathy, German political apathy, and yet the reality of what you researched?
Yeah, so I was very influenced by this concept of national indifference, because to me it seemed like a very useful way of describing the opposition or indifference to nation and nationalism that was very much part of the self-narrative of the Mennonite community that I came from, and that one can trace historically among other a variety of other Mennonite communities. And at the same time, there was also this affinity for German nationalism and German nationhood among a variety of Mennonite communities, a kind of watered down, latent version of which was present in my own family. And so that raised a variety of questions for me about thinking about the relationship between religion and nation in the context of this, fabulous recent research on the constructed nature of nations and the prevalence of national indifference deep into the 19th and even the 20th centuries in a variety of different places, particularly as studied in Central and Eastern Europe, but also elsewhere around the world. And so in my research, I came to think about this in a couple of different ways. One of which is to look at Mennonite communities and not assume that they necessarily had a strong national affiliation at any particular point in time. So in my book, I argue that there were very few Mennonites worldwide who had strong national affiliations or senses of national identity of any kind prior to about the mid-19th century, at which time forms of national identification started to develop in a variety of places. For example, Mennonites in the Netherlands increasingly came to see themselves as Dutch. Mennonites in German lands increasingly came to see themselves as German. And then I also took these ideas that Peter and Tara and others had been developing about national indifference and tried to think about their relationship between their relationship to Mennonite history in another way as well, which is to examine how communities that may have sort of identified perhaps even very strongly with a particular national context in one time and place might then, the very same individuals, the very same communities switch or develop a new national affiliation or identify some sort of self-proclaimed national indifference later. So Mennonites are a very good example of this because you can find cases where there are Mennonites in a variety of different places that identify in one context as German, for instance, but then a war comes, let's say the First World War in the United States. It's no longer particularly useful for those communities to identify as German, and so they would instead identify, let's say, as Mennonites. You have a very similar phenomenon in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and you also have a very, very similar phenomenon among Mennonite refugees who ended up in Germany from Eastern Europe after World War II, individuals who had identified as German during World War II, but found that to be a very inconvenient identification after World War II, when things like refugee assistance from organizations associated with the United Nations were not made available to refugees who were German, but were being made available to refugees who were not Germans. This is a case where Mennonites identified nationally speaking as Dutch or as Mennonites, which they considered to be their own national category. So these are cases where you might look at a sort of a group of Mennonites in aggregate and say there's a strong degree of indifference or ambivalence or side switching happening around the category of nation in this particular group.
Okay, but then you also argue that a lot of Mennonites were very much into nationalism, the idea of creating a Mennonite state. So how do you parcel that out?
Yeah, one of the arguments of the book is to suggest that there's a strong dynamic of group identification among Mennonites, sort of in a variety of different places in the late 19th century through the mid 20th century, because various forms of citizenship rights, of access to material resources, of organizing strategies and all the benefits that come with institutionalization group identities and forms are tied to certain ways of identifying. And so one of the things that I have wanted to suggest in the book is that even when Mennonites aren't necessarily identifying strongly with one particular national community, they often have had very strong group identities of one form or another. And so the trick then for the historian is not necessarily to say, is this particular group of Mennonites inherently German or inherently Dutch or inherently Mennonite, but rather to ask, how does the way that they identify as a group provide them access to certain resources or ways of being that are desirable to that particular community. So to give you an example, in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, identifying very strongly as German was seen as desirable to Mennonite leaders in Germany who were seeking to become part of the nation and to acquire for their communities all of the benefits that came with German citizenship and national belonging. You would find quite a different set of incentives at play in the case that you mentioned, being Paraguay in the 1920s and 30s, which was a place where having a strong German identification was not particularly valuable to those Mennonites who were interested in settling in the Chaco in the late 1920s and early 1930s, but rather what was useful to those groups at that particular time had more to do with the ability to appear desirable as settlers to the Paraguayan state, and also to mobilize resources from a variety of different countries, including Germany, but also the Netherlands, Canada, and the United States.
Yeah, so your research, as lots of research into Mennonites by nature, kind of has to be transnational and global because the Mennonites are very much so a global group. What was the hardest part of your research? Did you have to go to any crazy places, or just in general, did you find anything difficult?
Well, one could give an intellectual answer to this, and I would say to do that, I would say that one of the really challenging things about this project was to think about the category of Mennonites as intimately related to national categories. That's not a way that Mennonites often talk about themselves. And so to develop a project that sees Mennonites as fundamentally in the world, fundamentally part of the societies that they inhabit and move through, requires a degree of scholarly remove that can be challenging if you're embedded with your subjects, if you're talking to Mennonites who don't necessarily see the world that way. But one could also answer the question in a variety of other ways. I mean, one of the things that was certainly the most interesting about doing the project was to travel to the places that I was researching. So I went to many of the locations that are described in the book, to rural Mennonite communities across Europe and also in North America and Latin America. I traveled several different times. I made 3 different trips to the Chaco in Paraguay and met with Mennonite communities there, and did research in archives in the Menno and Fernheim colonies, and also in Neuland. And that was tremendously interesting, both to see the places that I was writing about in terms of the history of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but also to see how those communities had developed today, which reflect the legacies of the story that I've tried to tell in this book, and that other historians like John Eicher have told in much more detail.
Okay, so oftentimes you're talking about these categories as constructions, that Germanness, Mennoniteness, these are things that people really take on more so. as a form of identity. And there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of vagaries, it's kind of more of a spectrum. But so I even though I study the Mennonites, I'm one of the few Mennonite historians or soon to be historians that's not Mennonite. Oftentimes people who are Mennonite historians are also Mennonite historians. But I did, when I first visited a Mennonite family, I stayed with a Mennonite family in Ontario, and they found out I was studying the Mennonites. They asked me, they did something that they, as a community, all described as the game, which I don't know if you know the game. You seem to be nodding, but it's essentially going back in genealogy. At what point would I be have been related to these people? Because they all had assumed I'm Mennonite. Now, obviously, because I'm not Mennonite, I'm not related to any of them, at least not that I know of. But that made it it was just like a very interesting experience to me, because the idea of connectedness, it goes back into genealogy, and it also is kind of grounded in like kinship networks and really grounded in familial networks. That I think sometimes this idea of ethnicity or religion or nationalism can kind of lose that fact. So how did you think about that, or how do you like square that circle of Mennonite, it being an abstraction of Mennoniteness, which is a category that is religious, ethnic, that can be dropped, that can be changed, but also the reality of these kinship networks and the familial nature of it, the fact that genealogies are so important, the fact that oftentimes, even if these are families that are traveling across places, visiting other families that might be in different churches, and so that might cause issues, but they often are still writing and contacting these different churches, even though that they're supposed to be split with schisms because they have different doctrinal differences, but they still have the familial connections. So how do you figure that?
Yeah, so I would describe the Mennonite game, as you're calling it, as a kind of group building practice. Sometimes it's a nation building practice. Sometimes it's a race making practice. Sometimes it's a family making practice. Sometimes it's a church making practice. I wouldn't say that it's sort of fundamentally different than the way that members of any particular group would draw connections between themselves and others who they encounter. You might find this, among fans of a particular football team, for instance, who come from different cities and have never met each other before, but bond over their particular experiences having watched, football matches for their favorite team in the past. In the case of Mennonites, this particular practice of sort of engaging in discussions of self-recognition has taken many different forms in the past. I wouldn't describe it as a kind of unchanged practice from time immemorial, but rather something that's intimately related with the kinds of group formation that Mennonites who practice it are engaged with at the time in which they're engaging in it. So one example of the way in which some Mennonites in some parts of the world would have played this game somewhat differently is in the Nazi period in Germany, when Mennonites who played the Mennonite game were often very concerned with the construction of the racial category of Germanness or Aryanness, from a highly racialized perspective, where playing the Mennonite game was not merely about finding members of related churches, but it was also about demonstrating the ostensible, as they would have seen it, purity of the bloodlines. That's certainly different than how Mennonites who engage in this practice today anywhere in the world would play it, but it's an indication of how the meaning of a practice like that is related to the temporally and geographically specific forms of group formation that are being engaged in. So I wouldn't see it as something that's sort of outside of or prior to the ways in which groups are being formed in the present time. It's a kind of dialogic process between past forms of group formation and those which are desirable to participants in the present.
Okay. Um, in also in the introduction or the pages preceding the introductions, it's the pages where you're talking about how you describe things and the words you use. You talk about that you were going to preference, instead of using Russian Mennonites, you'll say Russia Mennonites and things like that to try and um, I guess subconsciously tell the reader like these are not nationalized groups, these are groups that happen to be in nations. Um, the only other place I've seen that or that I've really noticed was in Royden Lowen's book. So I wanted to know if you kind of borrowed that from him, or if you that was more parallel thinking. And I'm curious to what degree that might just be. Is to me? It's sometimes it reads like a little bit like splitting hairs, because even if you're Russian something, that doesn't mean you're innately Russian. It's just kind of how people colloquially talk. Um, so I don't know. I'm still kind of, for my own writing, I'm kind of thinking about how I would possibly use that. Um, so yeah, just what are your thoughts on that in general, I guess?
Yeah, I don't think that it's inherently super meaningful to say Russian Mennonite versus Russian Mennonite. I chose to use that practice because it was linguistically indicative of a larger move that I was trying to make. Book, and I thought that by kind of reminding the reader every so often, as they came across a phrase where Mennonites were described maybe a little bit more in depth as being from a particular place rather than being inherently part of a given nation, that would remind the readers of the overall argument of the book, which is that group formation and national belonging are historical and can change over time. So over the course of the monograph, I try to show how Mennonites in Germany and other places around the world went from being strongly identified with one particular national group to being strongly identified as not part of that national group, and in some cases back. And so an example of this is where you have Mennonites in 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 um, in Ukraine, in the Russian Empire, who before the First World War may be identified in part as German, and certainly did so in 1918 when German forces occupied various parts of South Russia and the Russian Empire, and then also did not strongly identify as German at particular other points, such as earlier in the First World War and then at various points afterwards during the Soviet period and beyond. And what I want to show with that narrative is the constructed nature and the historical nature of nationalism among this particular religious group, where sometimes they identify as German, sometimes they identify as Dutch, sometimes they identify as Russian, sometimes they identify as Soviet, and sometimes they identify simply as Mennonite. And the language that's employed in the book to suggest that they're Mennonites in Russia rather than Russian Mennonites sort of points towards what I think is a much larger argument that is borne out over the course of the book. The language I hope is useful in pointing that out, but the value of using that language isn't necessarily in drawing distinctions between phrases like Russian Mennonite and Russian Mennonite per se.
Okay, so for my own writing, I kind of sometimes, it might be because of I also am reading economic history, but I find myself using more of the phraseology of networks rather than ethnicities or groups. So ethnic network rather than it being an ethnic Mennonite ethnicities. And I think it's useful because it's not essentializing, and it also kind of inherently, people in the digital age kind of understand networks as a stand-in for connectedness, but not necessarily as one and the same. So that's kind of what I've kind of been thinking about in terms of how to get around this idea of groupism, and how do you talk about these things while not essentializing? Um, so what do you think about the big argument of groupism and individualizing stories? I think in one point of your book you're talking about how it's important to use individual stories rather than assume group. Um, but then I'm also when I read that I was thinking about, but could that also have a problem of making, like, to what degree are these individual stories representative of a greater whole, and to what degree are they just the exceptions? So how do you get around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I really like the language of network that you brought up, and I think that really is a great description for the approach that I adopted in this particular book. So instead of writing about Mennonites as a group where there's a kind of inherent group logic and innate ethnicity or nationality to any particular group of Mennonites, I, as you point out, find it more useful to think about what are the kinds of group building practices that this particular set of individuals is engaged in. Why are they doing that? Why does it matter? And how do those practices themselves inform what being Mennonite means to those who are involved? And so the strategy that I developed that I found particularly useful derived in part from the way that Peter Judson and Terrazera and others write about nationalists as activists who try to induce national or group behaviors and attitudes among larger populations, and in part also from your advisor, from Dr. Penny, who was a reader, a really wonderful reader of my manuscript, and really pushed me when I was revising the manuscript for publication to think very critically about who were the characters in my story and what was their relationship to the larger argument about group formation. And so the way that the manuscript developed, it identified a set of nationalists, or a set of actors who were mostly Mennonite elites in Germany, working between about 1870 and 1950, who were very similar. They tended to be urban, much more urban than the average Mennonite in Germany during that period. They tended to be educated, much more educated than the average Mennonite in that period. They tended to be somewhat wealthier than the average co-religionist during that time. And so this was a group of individuals who demographically looked very similar to other nationalist activists operating across Europe in the late 19th through the mid 20th centuries, who were trying to very intentionally using newspapers, using festivals, using travels and speeches and gatherings and a variety of other kinds of tools that one would expect to see among individuals with a similar profile in other national contexts, to induce Mennonites, who were in many cases quite different from them, to have a common set of attitudes towards Germany and German nationalism. And they were remarkably effective at that. And so I do focus on individuals, but I would say that these individuals are very much part of a network. There's something that's very similar between them. It's not as though any one among them was really driving the process in a direction that it would not necessarily have gone if they had not been part of the movement. And this is pretty similar to the way that other national movements developed during this period as well. You have a kind of nationalizing activist elite, where you have fascinating individual personalities, a high degree of contingency and personal agency, but you also have a kind of network phenomenon that tends to produce nationalism that looks remarkably similar across geographic locales in Europe and elsewhere from the late 19th to the mid 20th century.
Okay. So in both this book, but also in a lot of the writings I've read of yours from the Anabaptist historians blog online, you're really bringing out the idea of how Mennonites were really deeply involved in Nazism in the time, and there was a, I guess, preceding idea in the historiography that Mennonites during World War II were simply victims. And you're trying to, or it seems like that's one of your big arguments is like, well, no, they weren't just victims. A lot of the times they were either perpetrators or they were very much in allegiance to the Nazi Himmler. So a lot of that had been things I hadn't read before. So I thought it was very surprising, very interesting, and much needed in the historiography. So good job for that. But I'm also curious, and it might be because you have more of a focus on Europe rather than in Latin America. Did you find anything, not to bring it back to victimization of Mennonites, but did you find any problems with Mennonites in Paraguay or Mexico where the U.S. interned them, much like they interned many Germans during World War II, mostly unfairly? And so how does that kind of, how does that compare with what you are writing about are they actually Mennonites in Latin America who actually were Nazi sympathizers and maybe they should have been interned or not? Or to what degree were they just being labeled that? And is there any connection with, well, maybe the US thought that because of what they had found out about Mennonite leaders doing in Europe? Or did you find anything like that in your research?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I would say that there is a really inspiring cohort of historians who, for the last several years, has been writing excellent scholarship on the relationship between Mennonites and National Socialism in a variety of different national contexts. So, including the Netherlands, France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and also in North America and in South America. One of the reasons why that scholarship is so necessary is that Mennonites who had been pro-Nazi or Nazis during World War II, as well as other Mennonites who were aware of that, worked together to downplay that history after World War II in ways that reflected the self-interest of individual Mennonites and the Mennonite Church more broadly. And that downplaying of this history was intimately connected with these questions about nation and nationalism that we've been discussing. One of the ways that this history was downplayed or forgotten had to do with a post-war story that Mennonite leaders from the Americas and Europe jointly developed and propagated, which was that Mennonites in Europe were not, in general, ethnically German, but rather were ethnically, or from a nationality perspective, were Mennonites. And this sort of post hoc claim that Mennonites in Europe, many of whom had identified as Germans and had been viewed as Germans during World War II, were in fact not Germans, but rather members of a completely different ethnic or national group. That distinction helped to preclude questions about Mennonites' relationship to Nazism that was being asked after World War II of Germans in general. And if Mennonites weren't identified as Germans, those questions came to them less frequently. So recovering this history of the fluidity of group identity among Mennonites and their ability to appear as German in some instances, and the ability of some Mennonites to appear as non-German Mennonites, despite in many cases having previously spoken German, previously identified as German, helps to explain why this history of Mennonite-Nazi cooperation, collaboration, and connections has come to light and been thoroughly researched as recently as it has. So your specific question about Mennonites in Latin America, there are a couple of different ways in which the history of Mennonites in Latin America intersect with the history of Nazism. So one of which has to do with the foreign policy of the Third Reich and its relationship to Germans abroad. The Nazis, like other German movements before them, had a high degree of interest in Germans outside of the boundaries of Germany and provided aid to Germans abroad. And so there were some connections between Mennonites in Latin America and Germany because of that. The strongest sort of pro-Nazi attitudes developed among Mennonite colonists, of which there were several thousand in the 1930s in Brazil and in Paraguay. And in part had to do with the attention that was given to them by Nazi activists in Germany who wrote positively about them, wrote them letters, and in some cases also came and visited them in Brazil and in Paraguay. Some of those activists were Mennonite Nazis, some of them were non-Mennonite Nazis. But there was a degree to which the kind of propaganda about Germans being supposedly sort of a superior race, and in which Mennonites abroad were seen by Nazi activists as supposedly being racially superior agriculturalists and colonists in the places that they lived, was received positively by some of these Mennonite communities. So that's one connection. Another connection has to do with the decision by a small number of Mennonites in Latin America to actually move to Germany, to move to the Third Reich as part of the call that the Nazis put out for colonists abroad to come home, as it was described. So that's a story of only a minority of Mennonites in Latin America. Only possibly around 100 Mennonites from Latin America moved to the Third Reich in advance of the Second World War. And then there's this context that you raise about the concern of the U.S. American government in pro-Nazi attitudes in the Americas, and the internment of many German nationals or people who identified as German, even if they weren't German nationals, in the context of World War II. So, to my knowledge, there were the most significant stories involving Mennonites specifically regarding U.S. concern. There's other stories about the concern, particularly of the Brazilian government, about the pro-German attitudes of Brazilian Mennonites. But regarding the U.S. context, which you ask about, involves the leaders of, specifically two leaders, Fritz Kleber and Julius Legin, in the Fahrenheim colony in the Paraguayan Chaco. Those individuals were strongly pro-Nazi, and in 1944, with my understanding is backing of the U.S. diplomatic corps in Paraguay, the Paraguayan army was involved in the removal of those two individuals from the Fahrenheim colony because of their pro-Nazi attitudes, and they were then removed from the colony. My understanding is that they were not interned in the United States, as was the case of Germans who were elsewhere in Latin America, who the United States worried about their pro-Nazi attitudes.
Okay. So in the book, you talk about how even though there's kind of this idea of, well, the Mennonites were initially Dutch, but then they very quickly became German when they ended up in Germany. and you kind of push that back a little, say, well, no, they were still reading Dutch. Several communities lasted even into the mid 19th century, still being very much Dutch, like especially on the Baltic Sea with those connections. But then everywhere else, there's been a staying power with Germanness going to Russia, going to Latin America, even going to the US and Canada until the government forcibly implemented assimilationist policies. So why do you think that there was such staying power with Germanness and the German language that didn't necessarily happen with the Dutch?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and one might here usefully differentiate, I think, between different forms of Germanness. So there's a kind of cultural Germanness, which I think describes the German ness of most of the communities that you're talking about. And there's a kind of political Germanness, which is more the focus of my analysis of German national belonging and German nationalism in chosen nations. So at least using the kind of terminology and the methodological perspective that my book brings, I would view Mennonites most Mennonites in Latin America and in the Russian Empire, and in North America through at least a certain period. At one time, let's say the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and then speaking of Latin America, through the 21st century through today, most of the Mennonites in those particular contexts did not have a strong sense of German nationalism or strong sense of Germanness that was closely tied to political Germanism or to Germany as a country. And so these particular Mennonites, I would tend to think of as their Germanness would fall more into the category of national indifference that we were speaking about earlier. That being German for them, in many ways, had to do with not identifying strongly with the national context that they found themselves in. Germanness was a way to be separate. It was a way to differentiate themselves from their non-Mennonite neighbors. And there were historical roots to this particular form of Germanness that had to do with Central Europe, but would not have figured prominently in relation to any particular sense of national commitment or obligation to some foreign state, the country of Germany. That would be quite different than the form of German nationalism that was propounded by the activist intellectuals that I follow in my book in Germany, from the late 19th century onward, who would have suggested that Mennonites around the world were inherently members of the German nation and should have political allegiance to Germany in one form or another, and sought to promote that narrative abroad. So there's a kind of maybe 20th century story, especially from the First World War on, where you have a kind of convergence of a kind of cultural Germanness among many Mennonite communities outside of Germany that has long historical roots, but isn't necessarily tied to a political form of Germanness that intersects in interesting, complex, and unpredictable ways with a strong nationalist form of German nationalism that's very closely tied to promotion of the German state, emanating from activists within Germany itself.
So is that why you state that the First World War was a watershed moment in the construction of this worldwide bond of Mennonites? Was that primarily because of the MCC, or is it because of that's the beginning of these national activists?
Yeah, so you have an intersection of a couple of different things. In Germany itself, you've got a strong cohort of globally oriented, very pro-German Mennonite activists. You've also got the terrible tragedy of World War I, and for Mennonites globally, one of the real tragedies of that war was the way that it affected, and its aftermath was the way that it affected Mennonite communities in the Russian Empire, and then what quickly became the Soviet Union. And the Mennonites in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union during the First World War and its aftermath experienced a panoply of tragedies that really built on one another, that were not dissimilar from, and in fact were closely related to tragedies that were experienced by their non-Mennonite neighbors in the region, but which were experienced as a particularly or specifically Mennonite tragedy by the global Mennonite community. And so you've got civil war, you've got famine, you've got attacks by what are portrayed as bandits, and you've got the complexity of the formation of the Soviet Union, sort of all wrapped up in one particular time and place for a very large segment of the global Mennonite population who had been in the Imperial Russia and now found themselves in the Soviet Union. And that kind of became a major cause for Mennonites in a variety of different places, including maybe especially in Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, and the United States. And so nationality and nationalism was interwoven with this context, with the sort of perceived and actual crisis of Mennonites in the new Soviet Union in a variety of ways. One of which had to do with the fact that the sort of emerging Soviet Union was deeply concerned with the national identities of its citizenry. And so Mennonites' relationship to Germanists was important in the context of their relationship to the Soviet state. And then you have another context as well, which is the fact that Mennonite communities who were outside of the sort of young, nascent, forming Soviet Union, and who were interested in providing aid for their co-religionists in these tragic circumstances, were having to work together, despite the fact that they had a variety of very conflicting attitudes towards Germany and German nationalism. So you've got the German Mennonites who are very strongly nationalist. You've got the Dutch Mennonites who definitely do not see themselves as German. You've got the North American and the Canadian Mennonites who probably would have seen themselves as culturally German, but had really had incentives to downplay any political allegiance to Germany in the context of World War I. And you have all of these groups that are trying to provide aid in South Russia, in Ukraine, in sort of the new Soviet Union, and they have to work together with each other. And so the argument of the chapter that you're referring to, which suggests that kind of global Mennonite self-consciousness begins to develop around the First World War, suggests that it's deeply connected with nationalism and sense of nation, but doesn't necessarily cohere around the category of Germanness. It rather coheres around the category of Mennoniteness, which is very ambiguously related to Germany and German nationalism, not related to it in an obvious or direct sense.
So one is a question and one is a pushback a little bit. So the question is, because that also stuck out with me, because you're talking about this worldwide consciousness of being a Mennonite. But I mean, wasn't there many precedents with like mutual aid societies from the Netherlands still having connections with Mennonite colonies, even in Ukraine? And it was to me, it feels like it's more of a transference of the metropole of Mennoniteness, where it was originally centered around Amsterdam, the Netherlands, kind of financing missions, but also sending relief funds, even in the 1700s, to Mennonite colonies in Ukraine or in Germany at that time, but also missions to Indonesia, and also being connected with the Mennonites, even though they're Pennsylvania Dutch or Swiss Mennonites in the Americas. And then that switched from there to being primarily based in Canada where Canada is much more now the center of Mennonite-dom, if you could use that phrase,
Canada
or
is the center of
worldwide
a certain
Mennonite.
kind of Mennonite-dom.
Yeah. So that seems, I feel like I read that a little bit more of it's being more of a shifting of the center, rather than a new establishment. So what do you think about that? Why is it not? Why is there not precedent with the Mennonites in the Netherlands funding all these different groups? Why is it distinctly different after World War One?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with what you've said. There are transnational, or maybe better said, global connections among Mennonite communities that go back to the Reformation. And the Netherlands was much more prominent in that story than in the one that I tell that focuses on the 19th and 20th centuries. And in some ways, that shift that you're describing of a kind of global center for Mennonites moving from the Netherlands to wherever it moves. Germany is one hub. You've got North America as another hub by the First World War and beyond. Is, I think, a really fascinating story that could be better described by Mennonite historians. I think that would be a great research project. I think that there's a really fascinating history to tell there. So I do think that they're different. The moments that you describe are qualitatively different in a variety of ways. So one is that the kind of new centers that develop and the new networks that develop among Mennonites globally in the context and aftermath of World War I are really mediated by this question of nation and nationalism in a way that would not have been true at an earlier moment if you're thinking about Dutch missions or mutual aid societies. If you read the literature that surrounds those contexts, it becomes very nationalized by the late 19th century. But you do not find these same questions of national belonging, citizenship, and ethnicity, and even race that are very prominent among these discussions that Mennonites are having in the aftermath of World War I, particularly in the 1920s and early 1930s, where the ability to move large groups of Mennonites from one country to another is often, not only, but very significantly mediated by the question of what nation they are perceived to belong to. That matters a great deal to the German government in terms of its willingness to bring Mennonites from the Soviet Union into Germany or to provide aid to Mennonites in Latin America. And it also makes a very significant, it matters very significantly in a variety of contexts going forward that are all sort of specific and unique, but that all are deeply concerned with this question of nationalism. And then there's another answer as well, which has to do with the specific institutions that are formed. There's an emergence of durable global Mennonite institutions that come out of the aftermath of World War I. That is worth noting. So one of those institutions is the Mennonite Central Committee, which was formed in the United States in 1920 to aid Mennonites in South Russia and Ukraine. And that institution, was for the remainder of the 20th century the premier global Mennonite aid organization. You also have the formation in 1925 of the first Mennonite World Conference, which at the time, was seen as kind of a one-off conference, but ended up becoming the foundation for what today is still known as Mennonite World Conference, which is the main forum for Mennonite church bodies to gather on a sort of semi-regular basis from across every continent where Mennonites live. Those institutions are products of this era of Mennonite cooperation, collaboration, and engagement that was forged in the wake of World War I, and specifically in the context of concern about the fate of Mennonites in the Soviet Union.
Okay. So two more questions if you have time. So to what degree do you think that Mennonite nationalism or Mennonite affinity with German political nationalism is genuine ideology, and to what degree is it simply a substitute for anti-communism? Because from my reading, a lot of the Mennonites in Paraguay, some of them were, there's obviously anti-Semitism, but that's fairly true throughout that time. But there seems to be a belief that, well, yeah, they like Hitler because he's the leader of Germany that kind of gave them refuge after the Russian Revolution. And they really like that he hates communists. But there's a degree to which I'm not sure exactly that how much they're really aware of his racial policies, how much they're really buying into it, if they've really read Mein Kampf. So how much of the relationship between Nazism and Mennonite leaders is that genuine ideology? Are they actually true believers? They've read the literature, they're in full agreement. And how much is it that they've been pushed into it due to their experience of having been kicked out of what was the USSR?
Yeah, so Nazism was definitely a minority movement among Mennonites in the 1930s and 40s. Most Mennonites worldwide were not Nazis. There was a strong pro-Nazi and Nazi minority among Mennonites during this period. And as you would expect with any minority movement, the degree of enthusiasm and buy-in ran the gamut from total acceptance to total rejection. Especially in Germany, you have a substantial number of Mennonite leaders who were, not sort of vaguely interested in Nazism. They were Nazis. They were members of the party. They were activists. They were completely enthusiastic and evangelists for the Hitler movement. The story gets more complicated as you move out geographically for all of the reasons that you would expect. Paraguay is very far away from Germany, and Mennonites who lived in Paraguay had less access to and less incentive to identify strongly with the Nazi movement in the same way that they would have had less access to and reason to identify strongly with earlier forms of German nationalism. But still, there are strong connections. Someone like Fritz Cleaver, Paraguayan Mennonite leader, lived in Germany and completed his dissertation there, and married a woman from the Berlin Mennonite congregation. It's clear that they were strong and committed Nazi activists. Mennonites in Paraguay would have had access to literature and letters from Germany, and would have paid very close attention to it. They would have identified strongly with Germany, and it's clear that Nazism was very persuasive to that particular group of Mennonites in Latin America, more than would have been the case for most other Mennonites in the Americas, because of the particular history of that colony, which was founded in the early 1930s in the wake of that group's, or at least most of that group's movement out of the Soviet Union and through Germany with the help of the German government, the pre-Nazi, Weimar government, to Paraguay, and then many strong continued cultural contacts to Germany. As John Eicher has brilliantly shown, you've got another Mennonite colony, just down the road in the Paraguayan Chaco, the Menno colony, which had a completely different history. They had come several years earlier from Canada, had not passed through Germany anytime recently, had very few direct personal contacts to Germany, were much less likely to read German literature, were less likely to get visits from close friends who had recently been in Germany, and that was not a colony that developed a strong a strong Nazi identification. So if you have to look very closely at the specific geographical context, the cultural context, and the history of these particular different groups to be able to make a call like that. I think this question of whether any particular group sort of really is enamored with a particular form of nationalism, be it Nazism or any other form of nationalism, or whether they have a kind of expedient relationship to it is an interesting one. And this is where I think some of the theory and methodology that's been developed by historians of nations and nationalism is very helpful. In some ways, it's less useful to ask to what degree are these true believers, but rather how do their actions speak to the construction of national forms and forms of national belonging, with all of the ramifications that entails. So, in a certain sense, the history of Nazism among Mennonites in Europe is one that allows you to investigate this question in a way that you simply can't in Latin America, because all of the different stages of Nazism occurred, of course, in the Third Reich in the areas occupied by Hitler's forces during World War II, whereas Mennonites living in Paraguay never came under a Nazi regime, with the exception of those that moved to the Third Reich during the 1930s, and then also with the exception of the Neuland and Volendam colonies, which were composed of Mennonites who had been in Europe during World War II and then settled in Paraguay after the Second World War.
Okay, final question. I also ask everyone this. What is one book in the field that you think more people should be reading besides your own?
I mean, it's such a fabulous field. I think it's so exciting that we're talking about this, and I would love for historians and interested members of the general public to read more on the constructed nature of nations and nationalism. I think it has the potential to open up questions about what kind of society we live in and what kind of future we can develop that often seem foreclosed if we imagine nations and national categories as immutable and inevitable. I mean, I can recommend the book that started it for me, which is Peter Judson's Guardians of the Nation, activists on the language frontiers of the Habsburg lands. It's a fabulous book that really calls into question the immutable nature of nations and nationalism, and gives you a kind of blow by blow account of how communities that many individuals who live in them today would think of as being immutable and primordial, but that rather have very identifiable histories. And I think it's a brilliant book that many historians of nations and nationalism do read, but I think that people could read it more.
All right, perfect. All right, thank you so much. There's a very good book. I enjoyed reading it. And then I had to do a comparison between you and Eicher's book. Let's see where you guys disagree. I think for the most part, you are pretty much in agreement. It's just different context. He's focusing more on Paraguay, you're more on Germany. And so that kind of influences.
Yeah, I talked with John very extensively when we were writing our books, and I admire his book very much. His thinking influenced mine as I was writing my book, and I had the pleasure of speaking with him as he was developing his, and we read each other's articles that we were writing at the same time, and exchanged manuscripts. I would say that I think we have very similar intellectual influences, and I would be honored to see my book as part of a cohort with his that brings the history of nations and nationalism into Mennonite history in a new way.
Okay. And then I said that was the last question, but one more just question, because I noticed your new research it's on like the history of science and on a particular day, and it's as if you had read everything on Mennonite history, and then you just said, I want to study something completely different. I'm so burnt out on Mennonite history. What is something that is completely different? And you went for that. I don't know if that's actually what happened, but I'm interested to hear what got you interested in your new topic for research.
Well, I would say that researching and writing about Mennonites was a way to learn about transnational and global history. Mennonites are very transnational and very global. And I was really taken with the methodology and the ability that those methodologies lend historians to speak meaningfully to contemporary questions that that are on that kind of scope and scale. And so I, as someone who lives in the 21st century, am very concerned about questions of inequality and climate crisis and environmental collapse. And so I wanted to develop a project that could speak meaningfully to those concerns, but using the tools and the resources that I developed researching chosen nations. So in that sense, there's a very direct link between the two, but it's methodological rather than topical.
Okay. All right. I know you have another meeting coming up, so I don't want to take any more of your time, but seriously, thank you so much for talking with me. It was very interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much for these great questions and for the conversation.
All right. Bye.
See you.